The story everyone tells about America's first skyscrapers is one of steel, ambition, and engineering triumph. But in the 1880s, Chicago and New York faced a crisis no architect saw coming. City water mains delivered just 30 to 50 pounds of pressure per square inch, enough to push water to the 6th floor, and not a single story higher. Above that line, taps ran dry, toilets failed, and fire standpipes could not protect anyone. The hidden challenge of plumbing. These first high-rises nearly killed the skyscraper before it ever became an icon, because developers were already selling floors that water could not reach. By the mid-1880s, the skylines of Chicago and New York were changing faster than city engineers could keep up. Developers hungry for profit and prestige rushed to buy corner lots and tear down old brick walk-ups. In their place, steel-framed towers began to rise, 10 stories, then 12, then 15, each one promising more rentable offices, grander hotel suites, and a better view than the last. Building permits soared. In Chicago, the city issued over 1,200 new construction permits in 1885 alone, many for buildings 6 stories or higher. New York's Fifth Avenue and Broadway filled with scaffolds and cranes, their progress captured in glass plate photographs that now trace the city's vertical ambition. The elevator was the key that unlocked these new heights. Otis's safety brake, first demonstrated in 1853, had matured into a reliable machine by the 1880s. Suddenly, a room on the 10th floor was just as accessible as one on the 2nd. Developers wasted no time advertising these upper stories as prime real estate, flooded with light, free from street noise, and boasting panoramic city views. The race for height was not just about engineering prowess, it was a commercial contest driven by the promise of higher rents and the prestige of a building that stood above its neighbors. The first true elevator buildings appeared in the early 1880s. The Equitable Life building in New York, completed in 1870, was an early experiment. But by 1885, the home insurance building in Chicago had set a new standard, rising 10 stories on a steel skeleton. Newspapers marveled at the speed of construction. The New York Tribune published skyline panoramas showing a forest of cranes and half-finished towers. In Chicago, the Board of Trade Building's cupola soared 322 feet above the street, a height that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Speculators and syndicates poured money into these projects, betting that the demand for modern elevator-served offices would never fade. Hotels followed suit, offering guests the luxury of private bathrooms and telephones on the uppermost floors. By 1888, the Western Union Building, the New York Tribune Building, and the Chicago Auditorium were all competing for the title of tallest in America. Each new project promised more space, more amenities, more status for tenants willing to lease above the city's noise and smoke. But the rush skyward carried risks that few developers considered. While architects and investors celebrated each new record, a quieter problem lurked behind the walls. City water mains, designed for low-rise neighborhoods, could barely push water to the 6th floor. Above that, the pipes ran dry. Yet leases were signed, and tenants moved in, expecting modern conveniences, flush toilets, running water, and fire hoses on every floor. Building plans showed plumbing lines stretching all the way to the top, but the reality was less certain. The commercial drive to build higher had outpaced the city's ability to supply water, setting the stage for a crisis no one had planned for. Photographs from the era show the contradiction. Gleaming towers with ornate cornices and rooftop flagpoles, their lower floors bustling with life, while the upper stories risked becoming empty promises. The city's ambition was clear in every new building permit and every skyline portrait. But as developers raced to claim the clouds, the question of how to deliver water quietly, reliably, and safely to every tenant in every tower would soon demand an answer. City engineers in the 1880s faced a stubborn physical law. Water delivered by gravity alone could only rise so high before pressure gave out. Municipal mains in Chicago typically delivered 30 to 35 pounds per square inch at the curb, while New York's Croton Aqueduct could reach 50 pounds per square inch at its headworks. But by the time water traveled through miles of cast iron, lost pressure to friction, and climbed the first risers inside a building, much of that force had vanished. Fire engine trials and sanitary inspection reports from the period measured just 12 pounds per square inch at the 6th floor of a typical downtown building. At this level, even a 2-inch riser could barely coax water to the next story. By the 7th floor, taps sputtered and pipes ran dry. The numbers left little room for debate. Each vertical foot of rise consumed roughly 0.4 to 3 pounds per square inch of static head. In a 10-story building, the lift alone demanded more pressure than the city mains could supply. Engineers calculated that after friction losses in the rough interior of cast iron pipes, often 1 to 2 pounds per square inch for every 100 feet, residual pressure at the upper floors fell below the threshold needed for a usable faucet or a fire hose. Sanborn fire insurance maps from the late 1880s began annotating buildings above 6 stories with warnings that a booster pump was required. The problem was not just theoretical. Building inspectors documented low-flow complaints and outright failures in new high-rises. In New York, a Department of Buildings report from 1892 logged water pressure at just 10 pounds per square inch on the 4th floor of an East Village apartment, prompting citywide orders for auxiliary pumps. Chicago's Board of Trade building, with its cupola soaring above 300 feet, relied on a patchwork of private tanks and pumps to reach its upper offices. The city's own engineering handbook spelled out the dilemma. Without intervention, gravity-fed mains could not serve buildings above the 6th or 7th floor. Pipe roughness compounded the crisis. Cast iron of the era, with its coarse interior, produced head losses that climbed rapidly with each additional fixture and every tap-off for hydrants or fire hoses. During peak demand, morning wash-ups or fire drills, pressure at the upper stories could collapse entirely. Engineers traced the limits with equations, but tenants felt them in every dry faucet and every failed flush. The consequences went beyond inconvenience. Fire protection codes required a minimum pressure at each floor's standpipe outlet, typically 50 pounds per square inch for a usable fire hose. Yet empirical tests in both cities showed that above the 6th floor, pressure could drop to half that value. Insurance companies took note, raising premiums for buildings that could not guarantee water on demand. Building codes began to reflect the new reality, with explicit warnings about the upper limits of municipal service. For developers and city officials, the pressure ceiling was a hard stop. Ambitious plans for taller towers ran headlong into the physics of water supply. The race for height, so visible in steel and glass, now depended on a hidden contest with gravity and friction. Solving this impasse would require new technology and a willingness to rethink the very idea of how water moved through a building. On a chilly morning in 1887, a crew of coopers huddled atop a 10-story Manhattan office block, their breath visible as they prepared to assemble a rooftop water tank. Each man carried a stave, long, narrow planks of white oak, their edges beveled with precision. The staves, some nearly 12 feet tall, were stacked in neat bundles, ready to be shaped into a perfect cylinder. At the center of the roof, a steel tank ring bolted to the main girders waited to bear the weight of thousands of gallons of water. The assembly began with the base, a thick circular headboard planed smooth and slotted to receive the first ring of staves. One by one, the coopers slotted each stave upright, tapping them into place with heavy mallets. The geometry mattered. Every angle had to be exact, every joint tight enough to swell shut when the wood absorbed water. Once the circle was complete, the men wrapped the growing wall in steel hoops, each one drawn tight with a hydraulic press. The hoops had to withstand enormous tension, over 1,200 pounds per band, enough to keep the staves pressed together even as the tank filled and emptied, season after season. A tank of this size, holding 8,000 gallons, would impose a dead load of more than 66,000 pounds on the roof. Cooper trade manuals from the era included tables for calculating both hoop tension and roof loading, ensuring that the structure below could bear the weight. The steel hoops, often double-ringed for extra security, were spaced by mathematical formula, closer near the bottom where water pressure was greatest and wider near the top. Each was hammered home with a wedge, then checked with a tension gauge to confirm the reading matched the calculations in the Cooper's handbook. To waterproof the interior, the Coopers painted the wood with a pitch-based liner, sometimes adding a tar-impregnated felt for added protection. The final piece, the crown board, was lowered into place by a hand-cranked winch. The completed tank, a gleaming cylinder of oak and iron, stood ready to receive its first fill from the basement pumps. The elegance of the design lay in its simplicity and adaptability. The same techniques used for wine casks and brewery vats now scaled up to meet the needs of a city reaching for the sky. Every stave, every hoop, every calculation was the product of centuries of craft, now pressed into service atop the steel skeletons of a new urban age. As the last hoop was tightened and the tank filled for the first time, the Cooper on the roof could look out across a forest of rising towers, each one relying on the quiet strength of wood and iron to keep water flowing to the very top. On a quiet rooftop in Lower Manhattan, the work of keeping water aloft falls to a handful of specialists. Every spring, Mike Rivera, a master plumber whose family has cared for wooden tanks for 3 generations, climbs a creaking steel ladder to inspect the staves and hoops that hold back thousands of gallons. He checks each steel band with a torque wrench, feeling for slack that could signal fatigue. If a hoop has stretched, he replaces it with a new one, cut and annealed in the Bronx, before the summer heat swells the wood and locks the assembly tight. The pitch lining inside the tank, which keeps water from seeping into the grain, must be stripped and reapplied every 5 to 7 years, a job that leaves hands sticky for days. Rivera's maintenance log, like those kept by his grandfather, tracks the cycles of renewal. Some tanks last 40 years before the crown board needs replacement. Others succumb to rot or frost after just 15 days. The economics are always on his mind. A new wooden tank costs half as much as a steel one, but the upkeep, annual hoop checks, periodic pitch, winter draining adds up. Owners weigh these costs against the city's fire code, which still requires a roof reserve for buildings above 6 stories. In landmarked districts, preservation rules mean the replacement must match the original, right down to the white oak staves and hand-forged bands. Modern technology has crept in around the edges. Rivera uses ultrasonic gauges to spot hidden leaks and digital sensors to monitor fill levels. But the core of the job remains tactile, listening for the hollow ring of a loose stave, sniffing for the tang of pitch, tightening a hoop by hand. He has seen tanks survive hurricanes, outlast elevator motors, and weather decades of freeze-thaw cycles. When a tank is finally retired, its staves are sometimes salvaged for furniture, a quiet testament to their endurance. The tank is never an island. Its survival depends on the basement pumps that fill it, the pressure regulators that keep the flow steady, and the risers that tie it to every faucet and fire hose below. Rivera's rounds end in the pump room, where pressure gauges and relay switches hum. If the pump falters, the tank runs dry in hours. If a hoop fails, the whole system is at risk. The craft is not just about preservation, it is about keeping the promise of water at the top of the city, day after day, year after year. In the dim light of a high-rise basement, the heartbeat of a skyscraper was measured in horsepower and pressure. Steam-driven booster pumps, massive machines built by firms like Worthington Pump and Machinery and Fairbanks, Morse and Company, took over where city mains failed. Catalogs from the 1880s listed double-acting piston pumps ranging from 25 to 200 horsepower, their flywheels turning day and night to drive water up 12, 15, even 20 stories. A standard 50 horsepower Worthington pump could deliver 150 to 400 gallons per minute at pressures between 50 and 80 pounds per square inch, enough to fill an 8,000-gallon rooftop tank in under half an hour. In Chicago, a 75 horsepower model was often specified for towers above 10 stories, providing a total head of 170 feet and a steady 55 pounds per square inch at the highest tap. Designers relied on straightforward calculations. Each vertical foot of rise consumed nearly half a pound of pressure. For a building standing 150 feet tall, the system needed to overcome at least 65 pounds per square inch of static head, plus additional losses from friction in rough cast iron pipes. Engineers factored in peak demand, 150 gallons per minute for every 1,000 square feet of floor area, with extra capacity for bathrooms and fire hoses. The result was a network of pumps and pipes sized to supply thousands of gallons at a moment's notice, even during a fire drill or a morning rush. Pressure-regulating valves, often patented by Fairbanks in the early 1880s, controlled the force delivered to the risers. These devices allowed operators to dial in a target pressure, typically 45 pounds per square inch for domestic supply, up to 125 pounds per square inch for fire standpipes, while protecting the system from dangerous surges. Air chamber regulators, the predecessors of modern surge tanks, smoothed out the spikes caused by sudden demand or a fire engine draw. Gauges, calibrated in both pounds per square inch and feet of water, gave real-time readings at every booster station. Manufacturers competed to build more compact and reliable machines. Worthington's vertical piston design saved precious floor space in crowded downtown basements, while Fairbanks' horizontal compound pumps offered adjustable speed governors for precise control. Trade journals of the era featured cutaway diagrams showing the anatomy of these engines: steam cylinders, brass-fitted pistons, pressure relief valves, and heavy iron flywheels. Maintenance logs recorded weekly blowdowns and daily gauge checks, routines that kept the pumps humming through winter freezes and summer surges alike. Every gallon lifted by these engines was a victory over gravity. Without their relentless output, the upper floors would have remained dry, their promise of modern convenience unfulfilled. The booster pump, hidden from view but essential to the life of the building, became the quiet engine of the new urban skyline. In the basement of a Chicago high-rise, the night shift pump tender worked in a world of steam and shadow. Every evening, as the city above emptied its offices and the last elevator doors clanged shut, he settled into his routine, checking boiler gauges, oiling the pump's piston rods, and listening for the steady, rhythmic thump that meant water was still climbing through the risers. The machinery was massive, a Worthington double-acting steam pump, its flywheel spinning under the glow of a single bulb, delivered hundreds of gallons per minute to the rooftop tank. With only the ledger and the hiss of steam for company, the tender's job was equal parts vigilance and endurance. A faded entry in the 1889 pump room ledger tells the story of one such night. At 2:15 in the morning, a sudden drop in boiler pressure set off a chain of alarms. The tender, J. Hart, as signed in the margin, recorded the fault, then set about diagnosing the cause. The repair, logged at 45 minutes, involved tightening a leaking valve, bleeding the air chamber, and coaxing the pump back to life before the tank above ran dry. Every minute counted. If the tank emptied, tenants on the upper floors would wake to dry taps and, more dangerously, fire hoses with no pressure. The ledger's terse note read "Pressure restored, tank refilling by 3 o'clock in the morning," and it hints at the fragile balance that depended on a single worker's skill and attention in the small hours. Safety routines were as rigid as the iron pipes themselves. Each shift began with a walk of the pump room, checking the water level in the sight glass, testing the pressure. Governor, a device first patented in 1887, and verifying the relief valve setting. The governor, a brass and iron contraption, regulated the pump's output, preventing dangerous surges that could burst the risers or split a wooden tank seam. A careless adjustment or missed reading could send a shock wave through the system, risking a flood, or worse, a catastrophic failure upstairs. The pump tender's vigilance extended beyond the machinery. Any change in the sound of the pump, a rattle, a cough, a sudden silence, could spell disaster for the floors above. The night's quiet was deceptive. Every drop of water that reached the rooftop tank relied on the unbroken attention of a worker whose name might appear only in a maintenance ledger. The human link in the chain was as vital as the iron and steam. When the pump room quieted at dawn and the tank stood full, the city's promise of modern convenience had survived another night, held together by one man's watchfulness deep below the sleeping towers. On March 27, 1892, the quiet of a Manhattan office tower was shattered by the sudden crack of a cast-iron riser giving way on the 12th floor. The failure sent water pouring through ceilings, flooding offices below, and forced an immediate investigation into the backbone of high-rise plumbing. The city dispatched an engineer, Samuel H. Dorsey, to examine the wreckage. He arrived to find the riser split along a 7-foot seam, the iron fractured at a joint where the pipe had thinned from years of internal corrosion and repeated pressure cycling. Witnesses described hearing a sharp pop, then the rush of water as the column lost containment. Dorsey's inquiry, later published in the Department of Buildings Report BD 34, traced the origin to a miscalculation in pipe thickness and hoop tension. The riser, designed for 80 psi, had been subjected to surges well above 100 psi during morning pump cycles. Over time, thermal expansion and contraction from winter heating and summer cooling weakened the metal, creating micro cracks invisible to routine inspection. The repair bill reached $4,800, a sum that caught the attention of building owners and insurers alike, especially when the technical assessment cited inadequate joint welding and thermal cycling as root causes. The insurance claim, filed under Policy R11029, included sketches showing how the failed riser sat unsupported across 2 stories with no steel bracing to absorb the shock of water hammer or sudden flow changes. Dorsey's findings did not stop at diagnosis. He recommended that future risers in high-rise buildings be made of wrought iron or steel, with thicker walls and added supports at every floor. These recommendations became the basis for a new city code, which now required annual hydrostatic testing, stricter material specifications, and emergency shutoff valves on every vertical stack. The lesson was clear. In the vertical world of the skyscraper, the riser was not just a pipe, but a brittle backbone under constant threat from pressure, temperature swings, and human error. Every miscalculation carried real financial and safety consequences. The 1892 collapse set off a wave of regulatory scrutiny as engineers and city officials demanded better standards and more rigorous oversight. The hidden challenge of plumbing America's first high-rises had claimed a costly victim, and the rules of the game were changing. James O'Leary stepped off the gangplank at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1884, his toolbox packed with pipe wrenches and a roll of lead wool. He'd spent a decade fitting steam lines and bilge drains on Hudson River ferries, learning how to move water and waste through the tight, shifting spaces of a ship's hull. Now, standing in the basement of a 10-story office block, he faced a new puzzle. How to make gravity work for him, not against him, in a building that stretched far taller than any vessel he'd sailed. The challenge was simple in theory, but daunting in practice. Waste had to flow down 12, sometimes 15 stories, without clogging, siphoning, or flooding the lower floors. On ships, O'Leary had relied on flanged joints, hand-packed gaskets, and lead-soldered seams to keep pipes tight in rough seas. In the city, he adapted these same marine tricks to vertical risers, the old shipwright habit of overhooping a flange. Tightening it until the lead bulged gave him confidence that a waste stack would hold. Even as the building swayed in the wind, he wasn't alone. The United Brotherhood of Plumbers and Steamfitters rolls for 1886 list over 24 men with shipyard backgrounds working on new high-rises in Manhattan and Chicago. Their journals describe the first marine-style waste stacks, 4-inch cast iron, fitted with lead-soldered flanges at every floor, each joint hammered and caulked by hand. The method wasn't in any city code. It was born of necessity, passed from ship to skyscraper. O'Leary's notebooks, now tucked in the archives of the New York Transit Museum, detail his improvisations. He sloped the waste stack a fraction more at the base to speed flow, added air brake elbows borrowed from steamship condensate lines to vent trapped gas, and wrapped exposed joints in horsehair pads to cushion against thermal shock. Every adaptation was a hedge against disaster. A misaligned flange could flood an entire office suite, and a blocked vent could send sewer gas rising to the penthouse. This marine lineage shaped more than just the pipes. It trained a generation of plumbers to see buildings as vertical ships, each floor a deck, every riser a lifeline. By 1890, the city's most reliable high-rises boasted waste systems that owed as much to the Hudson River as to the building code. The downward flow, once an afterthought, became an engineering art, one that kept tenants dry, safe, and blissfully unaware of the silent journey their waste made from penthouse to street. A fire inspector's log from 1889, thick with the smell of ink and smoke, tells a story that haunted every city official tasked with keeping the new towers safe. In the Merrill Building, a 12-story office block in downtown Chicago, the Standpipe system was the last line of defense against disaster. The code demanded a design pressure of 125 pounds per square inch, enough to drive water through a fire hose on every floor. But that morning, during a routine fire drill, the rooftop tank was filled past its limit. The Standpipe, built from 2-inch wrought iron instead of the required 2.5 inches, could not handle the surge. At the 8th floor, the pipe ruptured with a gunshot crack. Water burst through the wall, flooding 3 floors in minutes. Firefighters arriving on the scene found the stairwells slick and useless, the Standpipe gushing brown water into the basement. Superintendent H.K. Larson, still in his shirt sleeves, pointed to the broken riser and the missing pressure relief valve, an omission that violated the city's new ordinance. The investigation, led by Fire Inspector John W. Haynes, documented the cause in precise detail: undersized pipe, no relief valve, and a pump cycle that spiked well above the safe limit. The city's fire inspection minutes record his words: "No standpipe under 2.5 inches shall be permitted above the 6th story. All must be fitted with a relief valve set to 120 pounds per square inch." The Merrill Building collapse forced a rewrite of the Chicago Building Code in 1890. From that point forward, quarterly hydrostatic tests and annual inspections became mandatory. Building owners faced steep fines for noncompliance, and insurers refused coverage without proof of testing. The lesson was immediate and hard. Above the 6th floor, fire safety was not a given. It was a calculation, one that depended on pipe diameter, pressure, and the vigilance of engineers and inspectors. The standpipe was no longer just a convenience, it was a lifeline, and its failure put every tenant at risk. The consequences of a single oversight now echoed through City Hall, insurance offices, and the daily routines of those who worked and lived high above the street. March 1888 brought a cold that turned New York's new towers into traps for their own ambition. As the blizzard raged outside, pipes froze solid from basement to roof. In the Manhattan Life Insurance Building, tenants on the 12th floor found their taps bone dry. For 2 days, water was nowhere to be found. Faucets sputtered, toilets stayed unflushed, and fire hoses hung useless against the walls. The city's pride in its vertical skyline became a liability overnight. Newspapers ran headlines about waterless towers and flooded attics, printing letters from office clerks and hotel guests stranded without basic needs. One account in the New York Times described a building superintendent breaking ice from the tank with a crowbar, desperate to restore service before tempers boiled over. Insurance companies moved quickly, raising premiums by nearly a third for buildings that relied on rooftop tanks alone. Emergency bulletins from City Hall warned of burst mains and urged landlords to insulate every exposed pipe. For many tenants, the promise of modern convenience had frozen in place, replaced by the reality that even the most advanced building was only as strong as its weakest pipe. The blizzard did more than stall water flow. It exposed just how vulnerable the city's tallest buildings remained to the forces of nature. Insurance companies wasted no time recalculating the odds after the pipes froze and burst in the blizzard of 1888. Within weeks, policyholders in New York and Chicago received notices that premiums on high-rise buildings that relied solely on rooftop tanks would rise by almost a third. Underwriters now classified uninsulated pipes and single-tank systems as high risk, citing claims from buildings where tenants spent days without water and repairs climbed into the thousands. The press seized on these failures, running editorials that questioned whether skyscrapers were safe or even sustainable. Headlines in the New York Times warned of waterless towers and frozen fortunes, while trade journals published tables comparing insurance rates before and after the freeze. A 12-story office block that paid $1,200 annually for coverage in 1887 faced a bill of $1,600 or more by 1889, with surcharges for every floor above the sixth. Building owners protested, but insurers pointed to actuarial tables and engineering reports. The risk of burst mains and fire with no water on tap was now a matter of public record. Historian Dr. Lila Green notes that this economic pressure forced developers to rethink not just plumbing, but the entire business model of the high-rise. For the first time, the financial viability of vertical living depended on what happened behind the walls, not just in the boardroom or on the skyline. Invisible systems still define how cities live and breathe. Today, over 60% of Americans reside in urban towers, each one reliant on plumbing innovations first improvised a century ago. As climate change and aging infrastructure test these fragile arteries, the challenge of moving water safely and reliably only grows. The next breakthrough may not make headlines, but it will shape the future for millions. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below.